want to make our form. We know how to make forms. We're going to try to make a stylish form. So let's see what Foundation offers in the way of that. So Foundation documentation. Got all kinds of stuff over here. Let's see. Where might that be? Let's look under General. Forms. There we go. We set out to create an easy, powerful, and versatile form layout system. Good. Yeah. All right. Get on my face. Form basics. All right. Easy but extremely flexible. Text inputs, blah, blah, blah. Looks like, yeah, that's all a little more complicated than I'm looking for right now. Checkboxes. Field set styles, help text, label positioning, inline labels and buttons. Ooh, that could be fun. If you look at this rascal, that button's just kind of stuck to the end of the input, right? That's kind of nice. So to attach extra text or controls to the left or right of an input field, wrap the elements in an input group container. It's got a dot there. So in other words, an element with that class. Then add these extra classes to the elements inside. This on the text field, this on a label if you have one, this on a button. Or not on the button. Place the button inside this wrapper. Okay, let's look at their example. Okay, so we've got a div with a class of input group. We've got a span, actually, with a class of input group label. We've got an input with a class of input group field, and we've got a div with a class of input group button that has a button inside it. Okay, let's start slow. Div with a class of input group. So underneath header here, I'm going to make a div with a class of input group. And again, using my fancy shortcuts, I can say just dot input dash group and expand that, and I get my div. Then we want an input with a class of input group field. Let's make an input. I wonder if I could do this. I wonder if I could do like I would do in CSS or query selector. Input dot input group field, expand. Oh yeah. Input type equals text, class equals input group field. Cool. And then it put the button inside a div called input group button. It didn't put a class on the, well, it put a class of button on the button. But this input group button is like a wrapper around the button. So after the input, but still inside my input group, I'm going to put that class on a div. Then I'm just going to put my button inside of it. Button with a class of button looks like. And this is going to be a list of our favorite Channing Tatum flicks. So add flick. That's what I want my button to say. If you can actually make your button say something that is a verb that actually tells you what the button's going to do, that's nice. I hate buttons that say OK and cancel. If you're prompting someone to save a document, it's a lot nicer if the buttons say save and don't save, or something like that. You never want it to be ambiguous what the button does. And depending on how you ask the question, it could be really unclear. So one of the easiest ways to avoid that, besides just writing good copy, is to label your buttons appropriately. So add flick is a good way to label this button. So here, so you don't have to slavishly copy, I'm going to throw this in Slack real quick. Or more so I can get it off the screen without stealing it from you. Let's see how it looks. Well, it did the thing. The input's really, really big, and it has a button at the end. So let's look at how that worked. Let's inspect it. I'm going to right-click this and inspect it. And I can see all the styles that were applied to it and where those styles came from. So I see there's a rule in there for input group, child selector, first child. This is coming from foundation. This rule is coming from foundation. Looks like this is applied to the class input group field. Looks like foundation has even more rules for input group buttons, input group field, etc. So the point is, by giving it those classes, there are a whole bunch of rules already in foundation that apply to that element. Yeah. Say again? Because I forgot it, that's all. That is the only reason. So, yeah, let's wrap this in a form. Thank you.
But it still showed up.
It still showed up. You can still have inputs that are not inside forms, but if you want something to happen when you submit a form, you need a form, right? So if we didn't have a form there, you know, we could listen for a button click, but we wouldn't be able to hit enter inside that field without specifically listening for hitting the enter button. Yeah.
What happens if the like submit button is below the list and it's still connected?
If it's what? I'm sorry?
It looks like this.
The CSS just probably isn't quite right. I mean, it'll still work fine. Just give me a second. So I'm going to go ahead and give my form an ID here. I'll give my form an ID of flick form. Shouldn't change the appearance, probably. It didn't. Notice something else. Foundation is a responsive CSS framework. Notice as I make my window smaller, the font size of that H1 actually changes. So there are a whole bunch of stuff that can change as your screen gets smaller in Foundation. That's one of them, just to make it fit a little better on phones and things like that. So there's a lot of stuff like that just built in. So we don't have to write that responsive CSS ourselves, necessarily. So now we've got a form. There's no label on this. We could stick a label. Have you ever used a placeholder? Anybody use placeholder? Yeah, tell us about placeholder, Evan.
Well, it's like the default text that appears within the box, and you just type over it.
So the label basically appears inside the input. How do I use it?
I think it was like placeholder equals whatever text.
So it's an attribute on the input itself. So input type text class equals this. Say placeholder equals name a flick. And if our calculations are correct. There you go. Now we have a light gray name a flick in there. And when we click in there and start typing, it goes away. If we backspace over it, it comes back. So you see that a lot. Now we can go ahead and fix some of the usability issues right off the bat here now that we know about them. When I first load the page, my cursor is not inside the input, right? So why don't we go ahead and autofocus that. Now this line 18 in my HTML is getting really, really long. So just to make it more readable, I'm going to put it onto more than one line. And when I do that with an HTML tag, like a single tag, this is how I usually do it. I just indent each attribute. And then the closing angle bracket, I outdent to line up with the opening angle bracket. You can put line breaks wherever you want inside a tag, as long as it's like not inside the attribute value or something. But this particular style is very common in React. So it's the habit I'm into, and I think it's nice and readable. Because we're not done sticking things on that input yet, are we? Because we're going to do autofocus. Autofocus. Cool. Also seems like it would be really silly to submit this form without having typed anything in it. So why don't we make it required as well? In the old days, you had to do this with JavaScript. When the form was submitted, look to see if there was anything in that value, and then stop the submission if so. In HTML5, you can just stick a required attribute on there. And by the way, even though it's the default, I'm going to put type equals submit on my button while I'm thinking about form submitting. And I'm going to go ahead and do this thing the same way. Class equals button, type equals submit. There's my button. So now my input has autofocus and required on it, and my button has a type of submit. The class of button was because Foundation evidently has some styles for buttons if you give it that class. If you don't want Foundation styles for buttons, just leave it off. Refresh the page. Doesn't look any different. But now let's try hitting enter. Well, our cursor's already in there, right? If I hit enter, it'll say please fill out this field. Now that's a browser feature. That's, Chrome has implemented that required thing. So if you want to be darn sure, you could still try to do that yourself. And remember, they could always bypass that and submit it anyway. So make sure you're checking things on the server side as well. Now I've got a perfectly fine looking form. Stretching all the way from left to right is maybe a little much. I'll put just a little bit of space around that. Well, no, not yet. Yeah, go ahead.
When the people are on assisted reading,
Yeah, using a screen reader or something. Yeah.
yeah, does it show when it they do the click thing? And
Is placeholder accessible? Is that basically what you're asking? Let's look that up. So input placeholder accessibility. Placeholder attribute can be used to place text inside an empty thing. Blah, blah, blah. Accessibility issues. So, I mean, the short answer is yes. It'll read it. Keep in mind, it's not all about blindness and screen readers, right? It's also good to have high contrast because gray on white, light gray on white is hard to read. So that's another thing to keep in mind. What color that placeholder ends up. Like on this screen, at least from this angle, that's a tad hard to read. So you could always change the placeholder color if that's a concern. But yes, screen readers will read a placeholder as though it were a label, basically, I believe. So I was thinking maybe I would wrap flick form inside a main element. Like I did last time. And that way, inside of my CSS, I have no custom styles yet. I'll just say width 80%. Margin. So margin and padding, if you do it, there's a margin top, there's a margin left, margin right, margin bottom, etc. Or you can do it all in one. If you do it all in one, it goes in this order: top, right, bottom, left. Same with padding. And if you just put two of them, that would be, the first one is top and bottom. The second one is right and left. I'm going to put one rim at the top and bottom, and I'm going to say auto for left and right. Anybody know what that does? Margin auto on the left and right?
Yeah, it auto adjusts.
It centers it.
Yeah, it centers it.
Long story short, it's going to center that div. So now it's centered in the middle, and 80% instead of absolutely the whole thing. Maybe we wanted to take up the whole thing. I don't know. All right, let's commit. Add flick form